condensation on the Waterford crystal goblet wept downward, pooling against my thumb. I traced the damp rim with my index finger. The ice cubes clinked against the glass, a sharp, fragile sound in the cavernous expanse of the dining room, crystal and silver. Sterling cutlery meticulously aligned on the heavy linen tablecloth. It was Tuesday evening in the Vance estate, nestled deep in the affluent, suffocating woods of Wellesley, Massachusetts. Tuesday meant roast lamb, mint jelly, and the ritualistic administration of my sanity. A single drop of moisture rolled off the goblet and hit the mahogany table. I didn't wipe it away. I kept my eyes fixed on the amber liquid inside the glass, sitting precisely 4 inches from Eleanor's knife. Her iced tea, sweetened with agave, garnished with a sprig of bruised mint, and laced with 40 milligrams of whatever Dr. Thorne had prescribed to keep the erratic, hysterical daughter-in-law quiet. "You haven't touched your lamb, Clara." Eleanor's voice was the rustle of dry autumn leaves over gravel. I lifted my gaze. She sat at the head of the table Julian had insisted she keep the seat after his father passed, framed by the towering antique grandfather clock behind her. Her posture was rigidly perfect, a spine made of rolled steel beneath her cashmere cardigan. The diamond on her ring caught the low light of the chandelier as she sliced into the meat. "I'm not terribly hungry," I said. My voice was steady. It was the first time in 6 months my tongue didn't feel like a swollen sponge in my mouth. Julian shifted beside me. The leather of his chair creaked. He reached over, his hand covering mine. His skin was warm, his palms smooth, smelling faintly of the expensive cedarwood cologne he wore to his downtown firm. "Darling," he murmured, leaning in close enough for me to see the individual golden flecks in his hazel eyes. "You need to eat," Dr. Thorne said. "The medication needs to bind to proteins. Otherwise, it upsets your stomach." The medication. The tiny, chalky white tablets that tasted like copper and left a lingering metallic ash in the back of my throat. The pills that made the walls breathe and the floorboards tilt. "I know," I said. I carefully withdrew my hand from under his, using the excuse of reaching for my water glass. I took it right before coming down, with a cracker. Julian's brow furrowed. A microscopic twitch disturbed the flawless line of his jaw. "You took it alone? You were on a conference call with the London office," I replied, maintaining a perfectly bland expression. "I didn't want to disturb you. I'm capable of swallowing a pill, Julian." Eleanor set her fork down. The silver struck the china with a resounding clink. The dining room suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. The heavy velvet drapes drawn over the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to press inward, sealing us inside this humid, mahogany tomb. "It's not about capability, Clara," Eleanor said, dabbing the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. "It's about compliance. After the incident last month with the shears in the greenhouse, we simply cannot afford any lapses. We are trying to protect you from yourself." The shears. I remembered the heavy iron weight of them in my hands. I remembered the hydrangeas I was pruning, but I did not remember slashing the upholstery of Julian's vintage Porsche. I only remembered waking up on the gravel driveway, my hands covered in dark grease and dirt, the shears beside me, and Julian standing over me with that look of profound, agonizing pity. That was the day Dr. Thorne doubled the dosage. That was the day the thick, gray fog rolled into my brain and settled there, turning my days into a smeared watercolor painting, until 5 days ago. 5 days ago, I found a small dead sparrow on the terrace. The medication usually made me indifferent to such things, numbing the world into a flat, distant projection. But that morning, I hadn't taken the pill yet. I had dropped it on the bathroom rug and spent 10 minutes searching for it on my hands and knees. In that brief window of clarity, looking at the stiff, brittle wings of the bird, a sharp, cold spike of realization had pierced the fog. The bird hadn't just died. Its neck was snapped. Cleanly, deliberately. I hadn't swallowed a pill since. Every morning, I placed it under my tongue, excused myself to the bathroom, and spat it into the toilet. The withdrawal had been a private agony sweats, violent tremors, a racing heart that threatened to crack my ribs, but beneath the physical torment, the fog had begun to lift. And beneath the fog was a terrifying, crystalline landscape of truth. I watched Eleanor's hand move toward her iced tea. My breath caught somewhere near my collarbone. I forced my chest to rise and fall in a slow, measured rhythm. 1, 2, 3. She picked up the glass. The structural integrity of this family requires transparency, Eleanor continued, holding the cold crystal against her lower lip. We have been more than accommodating, Clara. Most families in our position would have sought residential care. An asylum. She meant an asylum. I appreciate your patience, Eleanor, I said. She took a sip, a long, slow pull of the amber liquid. She swallowed. Her throat worked. She set the glass back down on the coaster exactly in the center. I looked down at my plate. The mint jelly was pooling around the edge of the roasted lamb like congealed blood. I picked up my fork and took a bite. The meat was dry, but I chewed it meticulously, feeling the mechanical grinding of my teeth. It had taken me an hour to grind her daily vitamins and my prescribed pills together in the mortar and pestle. I kept hidden behind the baking sheets in the pantry, a fine white powder, dissolved into a teaspoon of hot water, then stirred seamlessly into the pitcher of iced tea. Mary, the housekeeper, always left in the refrigerator for Eleanor's dinner. I had timed it perfectly. Mary left at 5. Dinner was at 7. 2 hours of the house being quiet, empty, save for Julian in his study and Eleanor in her reading room. How was court today? I asked, turning my head to Julian. He blinked, clearly surprised by the sudden shift in conversation. For months, I had barely spoken at the dinner table, preferring to stare at the patterns in the china as the medication dragged my consciousness into the deep sea. Fine, he said slowly, dissecting his meat. The merger is proceeding. The opposition is trying to stall with discovery requests, but it's nothing we can't handle. That's wonderful, I said, offering a small, practiced smile. You've been working so hard on the Sterling account. Eleanor reached for her glass again, another sip, deeper this time. I mentally counted the minutes. Dr. Thorne had always warned me about the fast-acting nature of the new prescription. It suppresses the manic neural pathways very quickly, Clara. You might feel a heavy sensation behind your eyes within 20 minutes. 15 minutes passed. The ticking of the grandfather clock grew louder, filling the silence between the scraping of silverware. Julian, Eleanor said suddenly. Her voice lacked its usual crisp articulation. The syllables smeared slightly at the edges. Julian looked up from his phone. Yes, Mother? The air conditioning, Eleanor said. She reached up, 2 fingers grazing her collarbone. The skin there was flushed, a mottled pink spreading upward toward her neck. It's oppressive in here. Is the thermostat malfunctioning again? It feels fine to me, Julian said, glancing at the vent above the doorway. Do you want me to check it? No, never mind. Eleanor blinked hard. Her eyelids fluttered, a rapid, disjointed movement. She reached for her water glass, but her hand misjudged the distance. Her knuckles struck the side of the goblet. It tipped. Water spilled across the linen, a dark, spreading stain rushing toward the silver centerpiece. Damn it, Eleanor hissed. Her hand jerked back, but the movement was uncoordinated, heavy. She stared at the spreading water as if it were a complex mathematical equation she couldn't solve. I've got it, Julian said, immediately grabbing his napkin and tossing it over the spill. He looked at his mother, his forehead creasing. Are you all right? You look pale. I'm perfectly fine, she snapped, but her jaw was slackening. The rigid, terrifying posture that defined Eleanor Vance was melting. Her shoulders dropped. She leaned heavily against the back of her chair. Just town. A sudden fatigue. It's been a long day. Perhaps you should lie down, I suggested. My voice was soft, laced with the exact tone of concern Julian had used on me 100 times. Eleanor turned her head to look at me. Her pupils were dilated, swallowing the gray of her irises until her eyes looked like 2 black holes in her skull. The hostility in her stare was still there, but it was unfocused, swimming in a chemical haze. I don't need. She stopped. Her tongue peeked out to wet her dry lips. The muscles in her face twitched. I don't need you to tell me what to do, Clara. Of course not, I whispered. Julian stood up. Come on, Mother. Let me help you to your room. You really don't look well. He moved around the table and offered her his arm. Eleanor stared at his arm for a long, confusing second before slowly lifting her hand. Her fingers fumbled against his sleeve, lacking the motor control to grip the fabric. Julian had to wrap his hand around hers to steady her. As she stood, her knees buckled slightly. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The room, Eleanor muttered, her head lolling toward Julian's shoulder. It's tilting. It's just vertigo. Julian hushed her, guiding her toward the dining room archway. Let's get you upstairs. He didn't look back at me as he half carried his mother up the grand staircase. I sat alone at the long mahogany table. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless ticking of the clock. I looked at Eleanor's abandoned iced tea glass. A thin ring of condensation remained on the coaster. I stood up, walked over to her chair, and picked up her glass. I walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, and into the kitchen. I poured the remaining amber liquid down the stainless steel sink, watching it swirl into the dark drain. I rinsed the glass thoroughly with scalding hot water, dried it with a towel, and placed it perfectly back in the china cabinet. No evidence, no trace. Just a sudden, inexplicable episode of mental instability from the matriarch of the house. I leaned against the cool granite counter, my hands gripping the edge until my knuckles turned white. A slow, unfamiliar sensation bloomed in my chest. It felt dangerous. It felt like power. The heavy, stifling veil they had draped over my mind was gone, and in the sharp, blinding clarity of reality, I knew exactly what I had to do next. The house above me creaked as Julian moved across the floorboards in his mother's room. He was playing the caretaker now. He didn't know the rules of the game had just violently shifted. I turned off the kitchen lights, plunging the room into darkness, and stood in the shadows, listening to the silence of the house, waiting for the real nightmare to begin. The heavy tread of Julian's leather Oxfords on the mahogany staircase signaled his descent. The rhythm was uneven, a syncopated dragging of his left heel that only appeared when the tight, perfectly constructed architecture of his composure began to fray. I remained perfectly still in the center of the unlit kitchen, the ambient glow of the security lamps outside casting long, distorted shadows across the marble island. My breathing was shallow, calibrated to the exact tempo of a woman heavily sedated. The hinges of the swinging door whined. A sliver of warm yellow light sliced across the floor as Julian pushed his way in. He paused on the threshold. His silhouette was stark against the hallway illumination. His broad shoulders slumped slightly, the knot of his silk tie loosened by a fraction of an inch. His hand swiped at the wall, and the harsh fluorescent beams above the island flickered to life with a low, electric hum. I deliberately delayed my reaction. I let 2 full seconds tick by before I turned my head, ensuring my neck moved with the mechanical, rusted stiffness Dr. Thorne's little white pills had forced upon me for half a year. I let my eyelids droop, fighting the sharp, electric adrenaline coursing through my veins, and stared at a spot somewhere near Julian's left clavicle. He exhaled, a long, ragged sound, and walked past me toward the liquor cabinet built into the oak paneling. The crystal stopper of the Macallan decanter clinked against the glass. The amber liquid hit the bottom of a lowball glass with a dull thud. He didn't offer me any. He knew alcohol and the heavy neuroleptics coursing through my supposed bloodstream were a fatal combination. He took a long swallow, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply. Only then did he turn to look at me. "She's asleep," Julian murmured, tracing the rim of his glass with his thumb. I had to help her into bed. She couldn't even manage the buttons on her blouse. Her hands were shaking violently. I kept my features entirely slack. I allowed my jaw to hang open a fraction of a millimeter. "Is she ill?" My voice was flat, devoid of inflection, a perfect imitation of a scratched phonograph record playing at the wrong speed. "I don't know," he muttered, raking his free hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the precise part he spent 10 minutes meticulously combing every morning. It was sudden. 1 minute she was lecturing me about the Sterling merger, and the next, she looked as though she'd suffered a stroke. Her pupils were massive. Her skin was freezing. He took another pull of the scotch. The ice cracked. "I'll call Silas in the morning if she isn't lucid by breakfast." Silas, Dr. Thorne, the man who had sat in my sunroom 6 months ago, his leather-bound notepad balanced on his knee, nodding sympathetically as Julian recounted my erratic behavior. The man who had signed the prescriptions that effectively entombed me in my own skull. "Should I make her some tea?" I asked, forcing a sluggish blink. Julian looked at me. His gaze crawled over my face, searching for something. I held his stare, burying my blinding, roaring hatred beneath a mask of pharmaceutical apathy. The muscles around his eyes relaxed. He saw exactly what he expected to see, a compliant, broken woman. "No, Clara. Leave her be. You should go up to bed as well. You need your rest." He set his glass down and stepped closer, leaning in to press a kiss to my forehead. The scent of his cedarwood cologne, a smell I used to associate with safety, now registered as the stench of a predator. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I allowed his lips to graze my skin, my arms hanging limply at my sides. As he pulled back, I noticed a tiny, dark smudge near the cuff of his white dress shirt. Grease. Not the kind from a kitchen, but something heavier, darker. The exact shade of the mechanical grease I had woken up covered in the day I allegedly destroyed his Porsche, the day my sanity was officially condemned. I turned and shuffled toward the stairs, counting my steps, ensuring my gait remained uneven and heavy. The night was a masterclass in endurance. I lay on the extreme edge of our California king bed, staring at the intricate plaster molding on the ceiling. Julian slept beside me, his breathing deep and metronomic. Every exhalation he made was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. In the suffocating darkness of the bedroom, my mind, free from the chemical sludge for the 5th consecutive day, began to frantically reconstruct the fragmented timeline of the past year. As an architect, my entire career was built on understanding structural integrity, finding the load-bearing walls, identifying the exact point where stress would cause a foundation to crack. I applied this brutal logic to my own life. The timeline was entirely wrong. The paranoia, the missing keys, the stove left burning, these symptoms had begun precisely 1 month after the fatal car accident that took my father's life in Chicago. An accident that left me the sole heir to the Vance Rutherford architectural firm and an estate worth more than Julian's boutique law firm could generate in a decade. Julian had handled the probate. Julian had managed the transition. Julian had started locking the doors from the outside because I was wandering at night. I turned my head a fraction of an inch to look at his sleeping profile. The moonlight filtered through the plantation shutters, casting thin prison bar shadows across his face. He looked peaceful. He looked like a man who had successfully neutralized a threat. Morning broke with the sound of rain lashing against the copper gutters I had designed 3 years ago. The house felt entirely different today. It lacked the oppressive, watchful energy of Eleanor's presence. I dressed slowly, choosing a shapeless beige cashmere sweater that swallowed my frame, further emphasizing the frailty Julian and Eleanor so desperately wanted to cultivate. I descended the stairs at 8 o'clock. The breakfast room was empty save for Mary, who was wiping down the granite countertops. The scent of fresh coffee and burnt toast hung heavy in the air. "Good morning, Mrs. Vance," Mary said, her eyes darting nervously toward the doorway. "Mr. Vance is in his study. He asked for breakfast to be brought to his desk." Mrs. Eleanor, "Well, she hasn't rung down for her tray yet." "Thank you, Mary," I whispered, pulling out my chair. The wood scraped loudly against the tile. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, savoring the sharp, bitter bite of it against my tongue. No more chalky aftertaste. At exactly 9:30, the heavy oak front door chimed. I remained seated, tracing the rim of my porcelain cup. Julian's heavy footsteps hurried down the hall. The low murmur of voices drifted into the breakfast room. Dr. Silas Thorne had arrived. I stood up, adjusting the oversized sleeves of my sweater to cover my knuckles, and walked silently toward the foyer. I positioned myself in the shadow of the velvet drapes near the archway, a spot where the acoustics of the hallway perfectly funneled the sound. Thorne was handing his damp trench coat to Julian. The doctor's silver hair was plastered to his forehead from the rain. "You said she was unresponsive, Julian?" Thorne's voice was crisp, laced with clinical detachment. "Not entirely unresponsive," Julian replied, his tone tight, defensive. "She's lethargic, severely disoriented. I tried to wake her an hour ago and she couldn't form a coherent sentence. Her speech is slurred. It's like..." He hesitated, the silence stretching taut like a piano wire. "It's like she's heavily medicated. But she only takes her multivitamins and the blood pressure prescription you manage." Thorne opened his leather medical bag, the brass clasps snapping sharply. "Let's not jump to conclusions. It could be a microischemic event, a TIA. Have you noticed any facial drooping, asymmetry?" "No, just the extreme fatigue and confusion, and her coordination is gone." "Let me see her," Thorne said. Their footsteps retreated up the carpeted stairs. I waited until the sound of Eleanor's bedroom door clicking shut echoed down the hallway. I had roughly 20 minutes. A thorough neurological exam from Thorne always took exactly 20 minutes. I knew this intimately. I turned away from the stairs and moved soundlessly down the corridor toward Julian's study. The door was solid mahogany, heavy and imposing. It was always locked. Julian claimed it was to protect client confidentiality, a necessary precaution since he frequently brought sensitive corporate merger documents home. But I knew the house better than he did. I knew the microscopic flaw in the locking mechanism. Before the incidents began, when I was still allowed to function as a human being, I had noticed the original brass strike plate was slightly misaligned from a shift in the house's foundation. I retrieved a thin, stiff piece of oxidized copper wire I had snapped off a garden trellis yesterday, currently hidden inside the lining of my right pocket. I slid the wire into the imperceptible gap between the door and the frame, just above the latch. I applied upward pressure, twisting the wire until I felt it catch the inner edge of the deadbolt. I leaned my weight against the wood. The door clicked, a sound softer than a heartbeat. I slipped inside and pushed the door shut behind me, the darkness of the room swallowing me whole. Julian's study smelled of leather polish, old paper, and the sharp, metallic tang of ink. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn, plunging the room into twilight. I didn't dare turn on a lamp. The dim light filtering through the edges of the drapes was enough. I moved immediately to his desk, a massive antique Victorian piece with intricate wood carvings. The surface was obsessively organized. Stacks of file folders perfectly aligned with the edges of the leather blotter. Silver pens arranged by size. I ignored the desktop and dropped to my knees, feeling along the underside of the heavy center drawer. My fingers brushed against a small recessed button hidden within the carved ivy pattern. A secret compartment I had discovered purely by accident during the house renovations 4 years ago, long before Julian's behavior changed. He never knew I knew about it. I pressed the button. A tiny muffled click sounded from the right side of the desk. The bottom panel of the lowest drawer popped open a fraction of an inch. I pulled it out entirely. The compartment was shallow, containing a single thick manila envelope sealed with a red string tie. My pulse began to hammer against the thin skin of my throat, a frantic, erratic bird trapped in my windpipe. I undid the string, the rough fibers catching against the pads of my fingers. I slid the contents onto the Persian rug. The first document was a heavy, watermarked stack of legal papers. The header jumped out at me in bold, unforgiving Times New Roman font. Petition for appointment of plenary guardian of the person and estate. The petitioner was Julian Vance. The proposed ward was Clara Rutherford Vance. I turned the page, my hands steadying with a cold, terrifying calm. The document outlined a complete transfer of my assets, the family firm, the Chicago properties, the trust fund into Julian's absolute control due to my severe, treatment-resistant schizoaffective disorder. The petition was dated for submission next Thursday. They were going to finalize it. They were going to lock me away in a facility and strip me of everything. But it was the second item in the envelope that made the air in the room suddenly feel impossibly thin. It was a small, spiral-bound notebook. The cover was generic, cheap cardboard. I flipped it open. The handwriting was Julian's, precise, slanted, aggressive. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger, an inventory. October 12, gas burner left on, placed Clara's reading glasses on the kitchen counter to ensure she was the last one in the room, documented with Silas. November 4, house keys removed from her purse, placed in the mudroom drain, waited for panic attack, recorded audio of her screaming. January 18, the greenhouse. My breath stopped entirely. My eyes tracked the ink on the page, the letters blurring and sharpening with sickening clarity. January 18, the greenhouse. Purchased heavy-duty pruning shears from Home Depot in Wellesley. Cash transaction. Applied motor oil to the handles. Sedated Clara's morning coffee with 10 milligrams extra lorazepam. Carried her to the gravel drive. Slashed the Porsche upholstery myself. Placed shears in her hands. Photographed the scene before waking her. I traced the word slashed. The ink was pressed so deeply into the paper it had left physical grooves. He hadn't just orchestrated my madness. He had physically constructed it, piece by piece, building a prison of circumstantial evidence around me while I was too drugged to defend myself. I flipped to the back of the notebook. A folded piece of glossy paper slipped out and fluttered to the rug. I picked it up. It was a photograph. Not of me, not of Julian. It was a photograph of Dr. Silas Thorne, sitting in a dimly lit restaurant booth, sliding a thick white envelope across the table toward Julian. The date stamped in the corner was 2 years ago, Long before my father died, long before my supposed symptoms began, Julian had Thorne on the payroll. The doctor wasn't a pawn, he was a hired mercenary. The diagnosis was bought and paid for. I squeezed my eyes shut, the pressure behind my forehead building into a blinding, agonizing pressure. The betrayal wasn't a sharp stab. It was a slow, crushing weight, grinding my bones into dust. Eleanor's disdain, Julian's fake sympathy, Thorne's clinical nods. It was a perfectly choreographed theatrical production, and I was the captive audience. A sudden, sharp sound snapped my eyes open. Footsteps, heavy, hurried, coming down the stairs. I shoved the photograph and the notebook back into the manila envelope, my hands moving with frantic, mechanical precision. I wound the red string around the clasp, shoved the envelope back into the hidden compartment, and pushed the panel shut. It locked with a soft click. I scrambled to my feet, smoothing down the front of my oversized sweater. The doorknob began to turn. The brass mechanism groaned. I threw myself toward the massive leather armchair in the corner of the room, turning my back to the door, curling my knees to my chest, and wrapping my arms around my legs. I began to rock slightly, staring blankly at the floorboards. The door swung open, hitting the bookcase with a violent thud. Julian stood in the doorway, breathing hard. His eyes darted around the dim room before landing on me. His chest heaved. The perfectly constructed facade of the concerned husband was gone. In the harsh light spilling in from the hallway, his face was pale, tight, radiating a sudden, feral panic. "Clara," he snapped, his voice sharp and breathless. "What are you doing in here?" "This room is off limits." I stopped rocking. I slowly turned my head to look at him, maintaining the dull, lifeless stare of the heavily medicated wife. I let a full beat of silence pass before I spoke, my voice a hollow whisper. "I was looking for my sketchpad." I lied, letting my lower lip tremble slightly. "It's so dark in my head, Julian. I just wanted to draw." He stared at me, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched rapidly beneath his ear. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. The sudden lack of light made the space feel incredibly small. He walked toward me, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug. He stopped, right in front of the armchair. He reached down, his fingers wrapping painfully tight around my upper arm, his thumb pressing brutally into the soft flesh above my elbow. He hauled me to my feet. I forced myself to go limp, letting him drag my dead weight upward. "Silas wants to see you," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Now, in the living room." "Is Eleanor okay?" I murmured, staring at his tie knot. Julian leaned in close. The smell of cedarwood and stale coffee washed over my face. "Eleanor is not okay, Clara. Silas says her blood work from the rapid toxicology kit he brought. It's showing massive toxic levels of antipsychotics in her system." He paused, his grip on my arm tightening until my fingers went numb. "The exact same antipsychotics you are supposed to be taking." He searched my face, waiting for the crack, waiting for the guilt, the panic, the confession. I looked up, meeting his hazel eyes directly. I didn't blink. I let the absolute emptiness of the drug-induced void reflect back at him, perfectly mirroring the abyss he had tried to push me into. "I don't understand," I whispered, letting a tear pool in the corner of my eye and track slowly down my cheek. "Are you saying Eleanor is taking my medicine, Julian?" "Why would she do that?" For a fraction of a second, the certainty in his eyes shattered. Doubt, sharp and jagged, sliced through his conviction. He released my arm and took a step back, staring at me as if I were a puzzle he suddenly realized he was missing the pieces to. "Let's go," he finally muttered, turning toward the door. I followed him out of the study, my posture hunched, my steps dragging. But beneath the oversized cashmere sweater, beneath the carefully constructed mask of a broken woman, my heart beat with the terrifying rhythmic precision of a ticking bomb. They had built this cage for me. Now, I was going to lock them inside it. The air in the formal living room tasted of stale ash and lemon polish. I kept my gaze anchored to the toes of Julian's Oxfords as he led me across the threshold. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind us, sealing the room. The sound was horribly final, like the dropping of a vault latch. The temperature in here was distinctly lower than the rest of the house. The massive stone fireplace stood empty, a black, gaping maw against the far wall. Dr. Silas Thorne stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to us, looking out at the unrelenting Massachusetts rain. His hands were clasped behind his back. The silver clasp of his vintage Patek Philippe watch caught the dull gray light from outside. He didn't turn around immediately. He let the silence stretch, weaponizing the quiet, allowing the tension to spool tightly around my ribcage. "Silas," Julian said. His voice lacked its usual commanding boardroom resonance. It was thin, frayed at the edges. "I brought her." Thorn turned. His face was a masterpiece of clinical neutrality. Not a single muscle twitched beneath his immaculately trimmed beard. He bypassed Julian completely and walked straight toward me. The scent of isopropyl alcohol and mint lozenges rolled off his tweed jacket. He stopped, less than 12 inches away. His proximity forced me to look at the knot of his maroon tie. "Clara," Thorn murmured. The cadence of his voice was soothing, a practiced, velvety purr designed to disarm hysterical patients. "Look at me, please." I let my head loll back on my neck, bringing my eyes up to his. I unfocused my vision, staring through him rather than at him, perfectly mimicking the vacant, hollowed-out stare he had engineered. He didn't speak. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small silver pen light. The metal scraped faintly against the fabric. My lungs seized. A cold drop of sweat broke loose from my hairline and traced a slow, agonizing path down the back of my neck. The light, the antipsychotics he prescribed, caused severe photophobia and pupillary sluggishness. If he shined that light into my eyes, my pupils would contract sharply, instantly, violently betraying my sobriety. "Hold her chin, Julian," Thorn instructed quietly. Julian stepped up beside me, his fingers clamped around my jawbone. The pressure was a warning, sharp and bruising. I allowed my mouth to fall open slightly, breathing in shallow, raspy gasps. Thorn raised the penlight. His thumb hovered over the switch. "Just a routine check, Clara. Keep your eyes open." Click. A blinding, needle-sharp beam of white light pierced my left eye. The instinct to flinch, to snap my eyes shut, screamed through every nerve ending in my body. I fought it down, burying the reflex under a mountain of sheer, desperate willpower. I kept my eyelids locked open, but I couldn't control my irises. I felt the agonizing, microscopic contraction of my pupil as it shrank down to a pinprick to block the glare. Thorn held the light steady for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, he moved it to my right eye. Another brutal flash of white, another instant contraction. Click. The room plunged back into dull gray. Thorn lowered his hand. He didn't step back. He remained completely motionless, his breathing shallow, his eyes dissecting my face. The silence in the room thickened into something viscous, something you could choke on. "Well?" Julian demanded, his grip on my jaw tightening. "Is she having an episode? Did she somehow get into Mother's room?" Thorn slowly turned his head to look at Julian. The mask of clinical neutrality had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating predatory stillness. "Let go of her, Julian." Julian hesitated, his thumb digging into my skin, before he dropped his hand. Thorn slipped the penlight back into his pocket. He took a deliberate step backward, creating space between us. "She didn't get into your mother's room, Julian. She didn't have to." Thorn's eyes locked onto mine. Her pupils are perfectly responsive. Brisk, bilateral accommodation. No nystagmus, no photophobia. Julian froze. His chest stopped moving. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Thorn replied, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register, "that your wife has not ingested a single milligram of ziprasidone or lorazepam in at least 72 hours. Her neuroreceptors are completely clear." The air in the room vanished. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the quarter hour, the brass notes echoing like a death knell through the silent house. Julian stared at me. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of old parchment. He looked at my oversized sweater, my slumped shoulders, my vacant expression. The illusion shattered in his hands. He saw the calculation beneath the facade. He saw the trap. "You," Julian breathed, the words scraping against his vocal cords. He took a step toward me, his hands curling into tight, trembling fists. "You poisoned my mother." I didn't answer. I didn't break character. I merely blinked, a slow, sluggish movement, and tilted my head to the side. "The water," I whispered, injecting a slight, trembling waver into my tone. "The water in the glass was too loud, Julian." It wouldn't stop humming. "Stop it!" Julian roared. The sudden violence in his voice rattled the crystal teardrops on the chandelier above us. He lunged forward, grabbing the collar of my cashmere sweater, twisting the fabric until it dug painfully into my windpipe. "Drop the act, Clara. We know. You ground up your pills and put them in her drink. You vicious, crazy bitch. Julian, release her." Thorne's voice snapped like a whip, sharp and authoritative. "She tried to kill my mother, Silas." Julian spat, his face inches from mine, a fine mist of saliva hitting my cheek. The cedarwood cologne was entirely eclipsed by the sour, sharp stench of his sweat. "And leaving bruises on her neck will make the guardianship petition completely invalid when the court-appointed evaluator sees them on Thursday," Thorne said, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. "Release her, now." Julian's chest heaved. He stared into my eyes, searching for the madness, but finding only a cold, impenetrable wall. He shoved me backward. I allowed myself to fall, hitting the Persian rug hard, my hip bone colliding with the solid mahogany leg of a side table. A sharp, bright flare of pain shot up my spine, but I bit the inside of my cheek to swallow the gasp. I curled into a fetal position on the rug, wrapping my arms around my head, playing the terrified, abused victim to perfection. Julian paced frantically in front of the fireplace, his hands tearing at his hair. "This wasn't the plan, Silas. This completely derails everything. If Eleanor dies, her power of attorney defaults to the charity board. The Rutherford Trust requires 2 familial signatures to transfer control upon my declaration of Clara's incompetence. If Mother is dead, I can't touch Clara's money. The firm, the Chicago properties, it all gets locked in probate for years." I lay completely still on the rug, the fibers of the wool scratched against my cheek. My heart was a sledgehammer against my ribs. The Rutherford Trust, my father's money. It was never about my mental health. It was a hostile takeover, a corporate acquisition disguised as a medical crisis. "Your mother isn't dead," Thorne said coolly, walking over to his medical bag resting on the leather sofa. He unclasped it. "She is deeply comatose. The dosage she ingested would sedate a horse. I've administered flumazenil, but her respiratory drive is severely compromised. Her heart rate is dipping into the 40s. We cannot manage this here, Julian. She needs to be intubated." "No." Julian spun around, his eyes wild, frantic. "No hospitals. If they run a tox screen, they'll find the antipsychotics. They'll see it's the exact same prescription you wrote for Clara. The police will get involved. They'll look at the guardianship papers. They'll see the transfer of assets. It's too messy. If I do not call an ambulance, she will suffer anoxic brain damage or cardiac arrest within the hour," Thorne replied, pulling a pre-filled syringe from his bag. He held it up to the light, flicking the glass barrel with his fingernail. "I am a psychiatrist, Julian, not a resuscitation specialist. Our arrangement did not include accessory to matricide." "Our arrangement!" Julian let out a harsh, barking laugh that bordered on hysterical. "Our arrangement, Silas, is the only reason you aren't sitting in a federal penitentiary right now." Thorne paused. His thumb rested lightly on the plunger of the syringe. He didn't look at Julian. He looked down at me, huddled on the floor. "Watch your tone," Thorne warned quietly. "Don't give me that," Julian sneered, the panic mutating into a vicious, cornered arrogance. He closed the distance between him and Thorne, stabbing a finger into the doctor's chest. "You think I won't drag you down with me? You think I kept the records in my desk just for nostalgia? I have the wire transfers, Silas. The offshore routing numbers. The $150,000 I paid you to alter Arthur Rutherford's autopsy." The air in the room stopped moving. The rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to violently amplify, echoing in the hollow chambers of my skull. "My father's autopsy." I pressed my face deeper into the rug, my teeth grinding together so hard my jaw ached. "Arthur Rutherford died of a massive myocardial infarction that caused his vehicle to strike a concrete median," Thorne recited, his voice flat, a rehearsed legal statement. "Arthur Rutherford died because you swapped his daily blood pressure medication for a lethal dose of unprescribed beta blockers," Julian hissed, his face twisted into a grotesque mask of triumph and desperation. "You induced the heart attack, Silas. You made sure he crashed. I orchestrated the merger, but you executed the hostile takeover. So don't stand there and act like you have a moral high ground. We are tied together." If the police look into my mother's poisoning, they'll look into Clara's prescriptions. They'll pull your medical license, and when they dig deep enough, they'll find Chicago. The pieces, jagged and blood-soaked, finally snapped together in my mind, forming a picture so horrific it threatened to shatter what was left of my sanity. The car crash wasn't an accident. The sudden heart failure wasn't natural. Julian wanted the architectural firm. My father, a stubborn, brilliant man, would never have sold it to Julian's corporate conglomerate, so Julian eliminated him. And Silas Thorne, the distinguished, respected psychiatrist, had been the assassin, using a prescription pad instead of a gun. And I was the final loose end, the grieving daughter who inherited the empire. The wife who needed to be driven mad so Julian could take the crown. I stopped breathing entirely. I was trapped in a room with two murderers who had just realized I was fully lucid, entirely aware, and the only thing standing between them and $1 billion trust fund. Thorne lowered the syringe. He looked at Julian for a long, calculating moment. The muscle in his jaw flexed. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. He simply accepted the tactical reality of the situation. "Fine," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a terrifying surgical whisper. "The mother stays here. We manage her conservatively. If she arrests, she arrests. We will claim it was a sudden stroke. But we have a much more immediate problem." Thorne slowly turned his head. His eyes locked onto me. She heard everything. Julian followed his gaze. He looked down at me, huddled on the rug. The panic in his eyes receded, replaced by a cold, hollow deadness. It was the look of a man evaluating a broken piece of furniture he needed to dispose of. "She's catatonic," Julian muttered, though the doubt bled through his voice. "Look at her. She's staring at the floorboards." "She's an architect, Julian," Thorne said, taking a slow step toward me. His leather shoes creaked against the hardwood floor. "She builds things. She understands structure. She understands load-bearing walls. And right now, she is looking at the foundational cracks of our entire operation." Thorne crouched down beside me. His knee popped. He reached out and grabbed a fistful of my hair, yanking my head back so violently, a sharp cry tore from my throat before I could swallow it. The mask was gone. I looked up at him, my eyes wide, hyper-focused, the adrenaline flooding my system and turning my vision razor-sharp. I didn't hide the hatred. I let it burn, hot and bright, staring straight into the eyes of the man who killed my father. "There she is," Thorne whispered, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Hello, Clara." "You killed him," I breathed, the words tearing out of me, jagged and raw. Julian stepped up behind Thorne. He looked down at me, and I saw the exact moment he made the decision. The exact moment I ceased to be his wife and became an obstacle. "The guardianship petition is useless now," Julian said coldly. "If she's lucid, she'll demand a blood test. She'll testify about the pills. We can't put her in front of a judge." "No, we cannot," Thorne agreed. He let go of my hair and stood up. He walked back to his medical bag and picked up the syringe. He tapped the glass barrel, watching a tiny air bubble rise to the top of the needle. "What is that?" Julian asked, his eyes tracking the needle. "Potassium chloride," Thorne replied, his voice entirely detached. "Undiluted. It induces immediate, irreversible cardiac arrest. It leaves the system incredibly quickly. On an autopsy, especially for a woman under extreme psychological distress who recently lost her father to heart failure, it will look like a tragic, genetic cardiac event. Broken heart syndrome, they call it. The air in my lungs turned to liquid ice. They weren't going to lock me in an asylum. They were going to execute me right here on the Persian rug." "Are you sure?" Julian asked. His voice didn't shake. He was fully committed now. "Hold her down," Thorne ordered. Julian moved. He lunged toward me, his heavy frame dropping to the floor. His knees pinned my legs to the rug, his immense weight crushing the breath out of me. He grabbed my left arm, pinning it to the floor, his fingers digging like iron hooks into my wrist. "Don't fight it, Clara," Julian whispered, leaning his face close to mine. His eyes were entirely black in the dim light. "You've been so tired lately. Let us help you sleep." I didn't scream. Screaming was useless. I felt the pure, primal instinct of survival detonate in my core. I went completely limp for a fraction of a second, letting Julian think I was surrendering. His grip loosened by a millimeter. In that microscopic window, I twisted my right hand, reaching into the deep pocket of my oversized cashmere sweater. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy iron handle of the garden shears I had retrieved from the mudroom before coming downstairs. The same shears Julian had used to frame me months ago. I ripped them out of my pocket. I didn't aim for his chest. I didn't aim for his face. I drove the heavy, rusted metal point of the shears straight upward, plunging them deep into the soft, vulnerable flesh beneath Julian's jaw, right where the carotid artery pulsed against his neck. The resistance was startling. Human flesh is not butter. It is a dense, fibrous weave of muscle, tendon, and sinew. The blunt, rusted tip of the pruning shears tore through the epidermis of Julian's neck with a wet, heavy crunch that vibrated up my forearm, settling deep into the marrow of my elbow. I didn't close my eyes. I watched the exact millimeter where the oxidized iron disappeared into the soft, pale skin just below his jawline, directly beneath the manicured shadow of his designer stubble. For a fraction of a microscopic second, time suspended itself in the cavernous expanse of the living room. The universe distilled into a single point of absolute stillness. Then, the carotid artery gave way. The blood didn't leak, it detonated. A pressurized, searing hot geyser of crimson erupted from the wound, painting the side of my face, blinding my left eye, and splashing violently against the pristine white collar of his dress shirt. The sheer heat of it was shocking, like boiling water thrown against freezing porcelain. Julian's hazel eyes, previously wide with predatory dominance, snapped into perfect, horrified circles. The malicious sneer calcified on his face, instantly replaced by the raw, unadulterated primal terror of a dying animal. The immense, crushing weight of his body pinning me to the Persian rug shifted instantly. The iron grip he held on my left wrist vanished as his hands flew to his throat, frantically clawing at the thick metal handles of the shears protruding from his flesh. He tried to inhale, a desperate, shuddering gasp for oxygen, but the air was entirely replaced by his own lifeblood. A horrific, wet, gurgling sound, the sound of a man drowning on dry land, bubbled up from his chest, spraying a fine red mist across my lips. I didn't scramble away. I didn't scream. I lay flat on the rug, my breathing perfectly even, the heavy, suffocating fog of the antipsychotics entirely replaced by a blinding, crystalline euphoria. I reached up with my free hand, wrapping my fingers over his violently shaking knuckles, and I pushed the shears deeper. Another horrific crunch as the tip scraped against his cervical spine. Julian's body arched backward, a violent, tetanic spasm of a failing nervous system. His knees slipped off my legs, slick with the rapidly pooling blood. He rolled sideways off me, collapsing onto his back. His expensive Italian leather Oxfords drummed a chaotic, frantic rhythm against the hardwood floor. His hands were coated in a thick, dark gloss, desperately trying to stem the arterial tide, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a sieve. I slowly sat up. The oversized beige cashmere sweater clung to my skin, saturated and heavy with his blood. I swiped the back of my hand across my eyes, clearing my vision, and looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. Dr. Silas Thorne hadn't moved. He stood exactly 3 feet away, his vintage Patek Philippe watch catching the dim light, the syringe of clear, lethal potassium chloride still held between his thumb and index finger. His face, usually a mask of impenetrable clinical arrogance, was utterly slack. The intelligent, calculating light in his gray eyes was gone, replaced by the blank, uncomprehending stare of a man watching the fundamental laws of physics shatter before him. He was a doctor. He understood anatomy. He knew, just by looking at the volume and velocity of the blood soaking into the antique wool rug, that Julian Vance had less than 40 seconds of consciousness remaining. Julian's thrashing began to slow. The chaotic drumming of his heels against the floorboards faded into a weak, rhythmic twitch. His lips moved, forming my name, but the only sound that emerged was a soft, wet hiss. He stared at me, his eyes pleading, begging for the very mercy he had stripped from me 6 months ago. I tilted my head, looking down at him with the detached curiosity of an architect examining a collapsed foundation. I felt nothing. No pity. No remorse. The space in my chest where a heart was supposed to beat was hollow, echoing, filled only with the cold, metallic satisfaction of a perfectly executed blueprint. Julian's chest hitched one final time. His jaw went slack. The light behind his hazel eyes simply clicked off, leaving behind 2 dull, staring marbles. The silence that rushed into the room was deafening. It was heavier than the ticking of the grandfather clock, heavier than the rain lashing against the glass. Thorne's voice was a frail, hollow whisper, entirely disconnected from his body. The syringe in his hand trembled, the tiny air bubble near the needle darting erratically. You severed the carotid. You killed him. I pushed myself up from the floor. My knees cracked in the quiet room. The soles of my shoes stuck to the saturated rug with a sickening, wet tearing sound. As I stood to my full height, I looked down at my hands. The blood was already drying in the crevices of my knuckles, turning a rusty dark brown. I merely expedited the inevitable, Silas, I said. My voice was smooth, resonant, entirely devoid of the wavering, hysterical pitch I had meticulously cultivated for the past half-year. I rolled my shoulders, feeling the tension bleed out of my muscles. He was a weak structural support. He was bound to collapse under the pressure. Thorne snapped his gaze up to me. The shock was beginning to recede, rapidly replaced by a hypervigilant, cornered panic. He took a slow, calculated step backward, creating distance, his grip tightening on the syringe. He raised it slightly, holding it like a tiny glass dagger. You're lucid, Thorne breathed, his eyes darting frantically across my face, searching for the broken woman he thought he had engineered. You've been lucid this entire time. The lethargy, the catatonia. It was a performance, a necessary adjustment to the architectural plans, I replied, taking a deliberate step forward. My voice was a low, steady hum. You and Julian built a very elaborate cage for me, Silas. The gaslighting, the hidden cameras, the precise calibration of the ziprasidone to keep me compliant, but not comatose. It was brilliant, truly. But you made a fundamental error in your calculations. What error? Thorne hissed, taking another step back. His heel bumped against the heavy stone hearth of the fireplace. He was trapped. You assumed you were the architects. I smiled. It was a terrifying sensation, the muscles of my face stretching into a genuine expression of amusement after months of forced neutrality. You assumed I was the foundation you were digging up. You never once stopped to consider that I drew the blueprints. Thorne's brow furrowed, a deep trench of confusion and terror. What are you talking about? Julian hired me. Julian orchestrated the takeover of the Rutherford Trust. We played you. Did you? I asked, tilting my head. I stopped moving, allowing him to absorb the absolute stillness of my posture. Tell me, Silas, how did Julian know about your little side business in Chicago? How did a boutique corporate lawyer from Boston find a disgraced psychiatrist willing to alter autopsies and prescribe chemical lobotomies? Thorne swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He had connections, the dark web. Private investigators. I let out a soft, echoing laugh. It sounded utterly alien in the blood-soaked room. Julian barely knew how to clear his browser history. He didn't find you, Silas. I found you. The color drained entirely from Thorne's face, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. The syringe in his hand dipped a fraction of an inch. No, that's impossible. Julian made the initial contact. Julian transferred the funds. Julian transferred the funds from a shell account I set up 3 years ago under his name. I corrected softly, the truth unspooling like a spool of razor wire. My father was a brilliant architect, Silas, but he was a moralizing, suffocating tyrant. He was going to leave the entire firm, the legacy I built with my own hands, to a series of philanthropic charities. He thought I lacked empathy. He thought I was cold. I stepped over Julian's outstretched, lifeless arm. The bone snapped slightly under the weight of my shoe. I didn't look down. He wasn't entirely wrong. Thorne pressed his back flush against the cold stone of the fireplace. His breathing was rapid, shallow, entirely out of his control. I needed my father dead. I continued, the cadence of my voice matching the relentless ticking of the clock. But I needed my hands clean. Julian was ambitious, greedy, and fundamentally weak. He was the perfect weapon. I began planting the seeds a year ago. A whispered comment here, a fabricated email there, making Julian believe my father was trying to ruin him financially. I made Julian desperate. I cornered him. And when he was panicked enough, I left your encrypted contact information on his desk, disguised as a spam advertisement. You, Thorne choked out the word. You engineered the assassination of your own father? I engineered a structural removal, I corrected coldly. Julian hired you. You altered the medication. The car crashed. The money transferred to me. It was flawless. Then why? Thorne gestured frantically to the room, to Julian's corpse, to my blood-soaked sweater. Why this? Why let Julian drug you? Why the guardianship petition? Why let us tear your mind apart if you were holding the strings? I stopped precisely 3 feet away from him, close enough to smell the stale coffee and pure, unadulterated terror radiating off his skin. Because Julian was a liability, I whispered, the volume of my voice dropping so low he had to strain to hear it over the sound of his own hammering heart. The guilt was eating him alive. He started drinking heavily. He kept that pathetic ledger in his desk. He kept your photograph. He was going to crack, Silas. He was going to confess, and he was going to drag me down with him. I couldn't just divorce him. He knew too much. And I couldn't just kill him. I was the sole beneficiary of his life insurance and the obvious suspect. I needed a narrative. I reached up and slowly wiped a streak of Julian's blood from my cheek. The sensation was warm, sticky. I needed an airtight, undeniable narrative, I repeated. So, I started leaving the stove on. I hid my own keys. I let Julian think he was gaslighting me. I gave him the idea to have me declared incompetent. I knew he would turn to you to supply the drugs. For 6 months, I have swallowed your poison, Silas. I let it rot my brain. I let you parade me around like a lobotomized dog. I endured the fog, the tremors, the absolute humiliation of Julian cutting my meat at dinner. I built an undeniable, heavily documented medical history of severe psychosis and violent outbursts. The realization hit Thorne with the physical force of a freight train. His eyes widened so far the whites showed entirely around his gray irises. He looked down at the shears buried in Julian's neck. He looked at his own syringe. He looked at the locked mahogany doors. Self-defense, Thorne whispered, the words trembling on his lips. The abused, heavily medicated wife, suffering a documented psychotic break, finally snaps. She attacks her husband. The corrupt doctor tries to sedate her with a lethal injection to silence her, but she fights back. A tragic, horrific domestic incident. I smiled, a cold, empty movement of my lips. Julian's death will be ruled a homicide by a mentally unfit ward. Your death will be ruled self-defense. I won't spend a day in prison, Silas. I will be sent to a luxury psychiatric facility for 6 months of rehabilitation. I will demonstrate miraculous improvement once I am off the toxic cocktail of drugs you prescribed. I will be deemed perfectly sane, utterly traumatized, and the sole heir to both the Rutherford and Vance estates. It is a masterpiece of architectural design. Thorne didn't speak. He didn't waste oxygen on a plea. He knew exactly what he was dealing with. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't a shattered woman clinging to sanity. I was the apex predator in the room, and the doors were locked from the inside. With a sudden guttural roar that tore his throat, Thorne lunged off the fireplace. He didn't aim for my arm. He aimed the needle of the syringe directly at my neck, seeking the very same artery I had just severed in Julian. He was heavier than me, fueled by the explosive, blinding adrenaline of a cornered animal fighting for its life. I didn't step back. I dropped my center of gravity, pivoting on my right heel, allowing his immense momentum to carry him forward. The needle sliced through the air, grazing the heavy wool of my sweater, missing my skin by a fraction of a millimeter. As his body slammed into mine, I brought my left elbow up in a brutal, compact arc, driving the sharp point of the joint directly into the soft cartilage of his throat. Thorne gagged, a wet, choking sound. But his momentum carried us both backward. We hit the floor violently, tangling in a chaotic mass of limbs on top of the blood-soaked rug. The metallic smell of copper was overwhelming, suffocating. My head bounced against the hardwood floor, a sharp crack of pain exploding behind my eyes, sending a blinding flash of white light across my vision. He was on top of me immediately. His knees pinned my ribs, crushing the breath from my lungs. His left hand clamped around my throat, his fingers digging like steel clamps into my windpipe, cutting off my oxygen. His right hand raised the syringe high above his head, the fluorescent light glinting off the tiny glass barrel and the deadly, hollow steel needle. "You arrogant bitch," Thorne hissed, spit flying from his lips, landing on my cheek. His face was a mask of pure, murderous rage, the civilized doctor entirely obliterated by the savage instinct to survive. "You're going to die here. I'll burn the house down. I'll make it look like a murder-suicide." My vision began to tunnel, the edges blurring into absolute blackness. The pressure on my throat was immense. My lungs burned, screaming for air. My hands thrashed wildly, my fingernails clawing at his wrists, tearing ribbons of skin from his forearms. But his grip was unyielding. The syringe began its descent. I stopped clawing at his arms. I stopped fighting the chokehold. I let my body go entirely limp, a dead weight on the rug beneath him. The sudden lack of resistance confused him. For a microsecond, his downward thrust hesitated. The needle hovered exactly 3 inches from my eyeball. In that microscopic window, I violently thrust my hips upward, bucking my entire body weight against his center of gravity. Thorne pitched forward, his balance shattered. As he fell toward me, I snapped my right hand up, ignoring his grip on my throat. I didn't grab the syringe. I grabbed his thumb, the thumb hovering over the plunger. With every ounce of strength remaining in my oxygen-starved muscles, I twisted his thumb backward, bending it past its structural limit, until the bone snapped with a loud, sickening crack. Thorne screamed, a high-pitched, agonizing wail. His grip on my throat vanished. The syringe slipped from his broken fingers, tumbling through the air. I caught the glass barrel mid-fall. Before Thorne could recover, before the pain even fully registered in his brain, I drove the needle upward with a vicious, unhesitating thrust. The hollow steel pierced the thick fabric of his tweed jacket, sinking deep into the dense muscle of his left pectoral, angling precisely beneath his ribs, toward the cavity of his heart. I slammed my palm against the plunger. The entire volume of the undiluted potassium chloride shot into his bloodstream in a fraction of a second. Thorne froze, his scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a hollow, terrifying silence. His eyes locked onto mine, widening to impossible proportions. The lethal dose hit his heart with the force of an electrical explosion. The reaction was instantaneous. The electrical pathways in his myocardium short-circuited. His chest heaved violently, a massive, unnatural spasm that lifted his entire torso off mine. His hands flew to his chest, his fingers clawing uselessly at the empty syringe still protruding from his jacket. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The capillaries in his eyes burst, flooding the whites with a terrifying, demonic red. He stared at me, paralyzed, locked in the suffocating agony of an induced, massive cardiac arrest. I lay still beneath him, watching the life violently extinguish from his eyes. I watched the realization hit him in his final seconds of consciousness, the absolute, crushing knowledge that he had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and eradicated by the very woman he thought he was controlling. Thorne's body gave one final violent shudder. His massive frame went entirely slack, collapsing heavily on top of me, pinning me to the floor in a dead, suffocating embrace. I didn't move. I lay perfectly still under the weight of the man who had murdered my father, breathing in the stench of blood, sweat, and death. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed the half-hour, a calm, measured sound in the slaughterhouse I had just created. The structural demolition was complete. The load-bearing walls had been pulverized. The foundation was clear. Now, I just had to survive the inspection. The dead weight of a human body is an entirely unique physical phenomenon. When the electrical currents cease and the spark of consciousness evaporates, the remaining mass of bone, muscle, and fluid settles with a heavy, unyielding permanence that seems to defy gravity itself. Dr. Silas Thorne pressed me into the saturated fibers of the Persian rug, his massive, lifeless chest pinning my sternum. The ambient temperature of the room was already beginning to leach the residual heat from his skin. I did not immediately attempt to push him off. I lay perfectly still, my cheek resting against the rough wool, breathing in the shallow, measured rhythms required to conserve oxygen under the crushing pressure. The air tasted of copper, voided bowels, and the sharp, clinical sting of the isopropyl alcohol that still lingered on his tweed jacket. The grandfather clock in the foyer ticked, a methodical, relentless metronome dissecting the silence into perfect, identical fragments. I focused on the sound. I allowed the adrenaline that had been surging through my veins, hot and blinding, to slowly metabolize. The violent tremor in my hands subsided into a dull, aching throb. I needed my pulse to return to a normal, resting rate. A traumatized victim of a violent attack would have a racing heart, yes, but a woman emerging from a 6-month, chemically induced catatonia, heavily sedated by a lethal cocktail of antipsychotics, would be sluggish, disoriented, barely tethered to the physical plane. I had to inhabit the ghost they had created for me one last time. I shifted my hips, finding a microscopic sliver of leverage against the floorboards. I planted my right heel and pushed. Thorne's torso rolled off me with a sickening, wet slump, his dead arm flopping heavily across my shins. I sat up. The joints in my spine cracked in the stillness. My oversized cashmere sweater clung to my torso, a heavy, sodden armor of partially coagulated blood. It was cooling rapidly against my skin, creating a tight, constricting shell. I pulled my knees to my chest, resting my forearms on them, and took a slow, deliberate inventory of the room. The architectural integrity of the space had been entirely violated. The pristine, symmetrical perfection Eleanor demanded of her home was obliterated. Julian lay near the fireplace, his limbs splayed in the chaotic, disjointed geometry of a violent death. The heavy iron shears protruded from his neck, casting a long, jagged shadow across his ruined collar. The dark pool beneath him had ceased its expansion, soaking deeply into the antique floorboards, staining the oak with a permanence that no amount of bleaching would ever erase. Thorne lay beside me, his eyes wide and vacant, staring blindly at the plaster molding on the ceiling. The empty syringe jutted from his chest like a miniature flagpole marking conquered territory. It was a masterpiece of carnage, a flawlessly executed demolition. I pushed myself to my feet, the soles of my shoes peeled away from the sticky rug with a sound like tearing flesh. I swayed slightly, allowing my shoulders to slump, forcing my spine into the fragile, bowed posture of a broken woman. I walked toward the heavy mahogany doors, my footsteps leaving faint, rust-colored impressions on the pristine hardwood of the hallway. The house was completely silent. The rain outside had softened into a persistent, miserable drizzle, tapping lightly against the glass panes. I bypassed the stairs leading to the second floor. I did not need to check on Eleanor. I knew exactly what the toxicology reports would show. I knew the precise half-life of the medication currently shutting down her central nervous system. She was either dead or trapped in an irreversible vegetative state. Her reign over this estate had ended the moment she lifted that crystal goblet to her lips. I walked into Julian's study. The door was still ajar. The heavy velvet curtains trapped the stagnant air inside. I moved behind his massive Victorian desk, the leather chair squeaking softly as I brushed past it. I picked up the heavy, black receiver of the landline phone. The plastic was cold against my palm. I held the receiver in my left hand, staring down at my right. My knuckles were bruised, the skin scraped raw from where I had clawed at Thorne's arms. Blood crusted under my fingernails. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs entirely, and then slowly exhaled, letting the air rattle against my vocal cords. I dialed 911. I didn't bring the phone to my ear. I left it resting on the polished wood of the desk, leaning down so my mouth was inches from the microphone. 911. What is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice crackled through the small speaker, tinny and distant. I waited. I let 3 full seconds of agonizing silence stretch across the line. Hello? If you have an emergency, please speak up. There is. I forced the words out in a ragged, breathless whisper. I allowed my lower lip to tremble, knowing the physical movement would alter the acoustics of my voice. There is so much blood. Ma'am, I need you to tell me your location. Are you injured? The shears, I murmured, my voice drifting, utterly disconnected, perfectly capturing the dissociative fog of a shattered mind. He tried to make me sleep again. They both did. I didn't want to sleep. Ma'am, the address. Please give me the address. I recited the Wellesley address in a slow, monotonous drone. I didn't wait for her next question. I let the receiver fall from the desk. It dangled by its coiled black cord, swinging like a pendulum, the dispatcher's frantic voice echoing faintly in the dim study. I turned and walked to the corner of the room, curling myself into the same leather armchair I had occupied when Julian found me earlier. I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapped my arms around my legs, and fixed my gaze on a knot in the floorboards. I began to rock, a slow, hypnotic, metronomic sway, forward and back, forward and back. I waited for the sirens. They arrived precisely 12 minutes later. The wail of the police cruisers tore through the quiet affluence of the neighborhood, bouncing off the dense tree line and shattering the illusion of safety. Red and blue lights strobed frantically through the rain-streaked windows, throwing chaotic, spinning shadows across the walls of the study. Car doors slammed, heavy boots crunched against the gravel driveway. Flashlights swept across the front facade of the house. Wellesley Police, open the door. I did not stop rocking. I did not alter the rhythm of my breath. A heavy, violent thud echoed through the foyer as they breached the front door. The wood splintered. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness of the hallway like solid pillars of white dust. Clear the hall. Check the rooms. Their voices were sharp, laced with adrenaline. Footsteps pounded against the hardwood. I heard the exact moment the first two officers entered the formal living room. The tactical commands abruptly ceased, replaced by a dense, horrified silence. Jesus Christ, a deep voice muttered. The sound of a radio microphone clicking on. Dispatch, we have a double homicide. Code red. Get the paramedics here now. Secure the perimeter. More boots. Running now. A beam of light swept into the study, catching the dust motes in the air, before locking onto me. In here. I've got a survivor. An officer rushed into the room, his weapon drawn but lowered the moment he registered my posture. He holstered it quickly and dropped to his knees in front of the armchair. He was young, his face pale beneath the harsh glare of his tactical flashlight. Ma'am? Mrs. Vance? I need you to look at me. I kept my eyes fixed on the floorboard. I didn't blink. I let the absolute emptiness of the abyss I had simulated for half a year swallow the reflection in my eyes. We need a medic in the study, the officer yelled over his shoulder. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering inches from my shoulder, terrified to touch the blood-soaked cashmere. Ma'am, you're safe now. Can you tell me what happened? I slowly ceased rocking. I turned my head, the movement rusted and painfully slow, until my gaze met his. I looked through him, focusing on the dark wood paneling behind his head. They were architects, I whispered, my voice a dry, hollow rasp. But their foundation was built on sand. The transition from the estate to the hospital was a blur of flashing lights, sterile gauze, and low, urgent voices. They wrapped me in a thick, metallic foil blanket that crinkled loudly with every breath I took. They strapped me to a gurney, their hands gentle, terrified of shattering the fragile, traumatized shell of the woman they believed me to be. The emergency room was a blinding expanse of white fluorescent light and the sharp scent of bleach. I offered no resistance as they drew my blood, tracing the needles into my veins to run the toxicology screens. I knew exactly what they would find. A massive, debilitating concentration of the antipsychotic Silas Thorne had prescribed me. A chemical straitjacket documented perfectly in my medical files. Detectives came and went. Men in cheap suits with tired eyes and soft, patronizing voices. They sat in the plastic chairs beside my hospital bed, holding small notepads, asking gentle, leading questions. Take your time, Mrs. Vance. We know this is incredibly difficult. I gave them exactly what they needed. Fractured sentences, tears that flowed silently down my cheeks, washing away the dried flakes of Julian's blood. I told them about the fog. I told them about Julian locking the doors. I told them how Thorne would shine the light in my eyes and write his prescriptions. I told them how I woke up on the rug, the shears in my hand, with Julian's hands around my throat and the needle descending toward my face. The narrative assembled itself perfectly in their minds, just as I had drafted it. The evidence was insurmountable. Thorne's bag, filled with the lethal potassium chloride, the guardianship papers in Julian's desk. Eleanor, discovered comatose in her bed, her blood screaming with the exact same toxins they found in mine. It was a closed loop, a tragedy of domestic abuse and medical malpractice that culminated in a desperate act of primal self-defense. 3 months later, I sat by the window of the private, exclusive psychiatric recovery center nestled in the Berkshires. The room was aggressively serene, pale walls, soft linens, the scent of lavender pumped through the air vents. Outside, the leaves of the oak trees were turning the color of rust and dried blood. The court hearings had concluded precisely as my lawyer's expensive, aggressive men I had hired with the Rutherford Trust money had predicted. I was cleared of all charges. The judge had looked down at me from his bench, his eyes swimming with profound pity, and officially transferred sole, unencumbered control of the Vance estate and my father's architectural empire back into my name. Julian was buried in the family plot. Eleanor remained in a persistent vegetative state, in a high-end nursing facility, entirely dependent on machines that I graciously paid for every month. Thorn was a disgraced memory, his medical license posthumously revoked. I was cured. The fog had lifted. The trauma, they said, was severe, but my resilience was inspiring. I raised a porcelain cup to my lips and took a sip of the black tea. It was hot, bitter, and completely untainted. I looked out at the rolling hills, at the sprawling estate that now belonged entirely to me. I had dismantled the prison they built for me. I had weaponized my own prescribed madness. I had orchestrated the perfect, unassailable demolition, leaving no trace of my own handiwork beneath the rubble. I placed the cup softly on the saucer. The porcelain made a tiny, sharp clink in the absolute quiet of the room. I looked down at my hands. They were clean, scrubbed raw, manicured, entirely free of dirt, grease, or blood. Yet, as I sat alone in the immaculate silence of my victory, staring at the flawless, pristine walls of my sanctuary, I realized the most terrifying truth of structural engineering. When you spend so long pretending to be a monster trapped in the darkness eventually forgets it was supposed to be an act.